Gospel is a continuation of the narrative that we have been following for several weeks now. Jesus' ministry in Galilee continues to grow and is gaining popularity and is increasingly threatening to those in power, both religiously and politically. At the same time, Jesus needs some alone time to take stock, pray, recommit, and just rest. And he's not able to get that when surrounded by crowds of thousands. So this time, he heads north towards modern Lebanon, a place that the evangelist Matthew identifies as the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, on the one hand, that was the ancient name of this region, and it is again in modern times. So people would know where Matthew meant Jesus was going. But on the other hand, in the period in which Jesus and Matthew lived, this region would have been called Syria. And then Matthew identifies the woman not as being from Tyre or Sidon, or as the Syro-Phoenician woman, as she is called in Mark, but rather a Canaanite. Matthew makes deliberate, anachronistic word choices, which I do not think we can ignore, especially in a story in which Jesus calls a woman a dog. And let's be clear, that is exactly what both Matthew and Mark describe Jesus as doing. The Son of God, love personified, called another human being an animal, according to the scriptures. How can we make sense of this? As I said, I think the best way to understand what Matthew was trying to say is to look at the language he used, and the fact that he chose words that called back to an earlier time. The names Tyre and Sidon and the identification of the woman as a Canaanite call to mind the vast history of the Jewish people and their neighbors. Both the Jews and the Canaanites were Semitic peoples who spoke similar languages and shared common ancestry. Tyre and Sidon, in a particular way, was known for being wealthier due to the production of purple dye from seashells that was prized as being worth more than its weight in gold, and for cedars, from which the giant masts of seagoing ships and watertight hulls could be made. And at one point in history, centuries before Jesus, a colony of Tyre and Sidon had risen to become a rival to Rome itself, that of Carthage. But for most of its history, despite their wealth and seafaring abilities, Tyre and Sidon, like Judea and Galilee, were bumps in the road for forging great empires. To connect by land, the east and the west, and the north and the south, to reach the Mediterranean from the Arabian Desert, and Greece from Egypt meant crossing through these territories. And so they faced repeated conquest by the ancient empires of Assyria, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. In many ways, the Canaanite woman Jesus met was facing the same realities as many of the Jewish people he had spent his ministry with to the south. But she was a pagan, and they were Jewish. She worshipped the old gods, the ones whom the one God had replaced amongst the Jewish people, the ones who had called for human sacrifice in the days before the Romans. This woman represented the people who the prophets warned against, and whose kings led the kings of Israel and Judah into sin. And despite the fact that Jesus was headed north, careful reading indicates that he did not actually cross into Gentile territory. Rather, she came out to him. Canaanite woman represents a foreigner in the midst of the Jewish people of Galilee, someone with a shared history and who may have lived in a mixed village or in a Gentile village bordering a Jewish one. Someone whose history in this land ran as deep as anyone else's, but who would always be seen as foreign, suspicious, and unworthy, like a stray dog sniffing around the edges of a garbage heap. Now, this is the story of people on the other side of the Atlantic, 2,000 years ago, with distinct cultural and historical circumstances. But in opening today's newspaper and going about my day yesterday, I cannot help but think that this is very much the story of who we are today as well. See, yesterday my sons and I rode on a Buffalo Sewers float in the Puerto Rican and Hispanic Day Parade. When we were milling around waiting for the parade to start, I saw a t-shirt that read, "Keep calm and carry on. Puerto Ricans are legal." Now, I understand the sentiment. time when anyone speaking Spanish can face discrimination and suspicion. There can be a very strong urge to separate Puerto Ricans from other Spanish speakers. Others might be here illegally, but Puerto Ricans are legal. At the same time, though, not only does it not challenge the very notion that speaking Spanish, the first European language spoken in what is now the United States, is somehow foreign, and the Spanish-speaking immigrants are all illegal. It also ignores the fact that Puerto Ricans aren't immigrants. They are citizens of this United States. And Puerto Rico, a territory with vast infrastructure failures, is part of the United States. But it is an island and is populated by people who speak Spanish and who have ancestry that is European, African, Native American, and Asian. They do not always look white. For many Americans, in particular white Americans, this means that these Americans do not look American. They do not sound American and are perceived to be foreigners, despite ancestry in the United States that is millennia older than my own. In the same way, we read about the infrastructure failures on Maui that allowed a smoldering brush fire to erupt into an inferno that devoured hundreds of lives in the course of a single night. Despite statehood and being the birthplace of one of our presidents, Hawaii is still seen as separate from the rest of the United States. A place to vacation, but not really a part of the rest of us. And Native Hawaiians are seen as not quite American. Even Black Americans, people whose history is intimately tied up with that of white Americans, whose culture, families, freedom, and lives were sacrificed to build the wealth of this nation, even they are not seen as real Americans by many white people in these United States. And the way that slavery is talked about makes this foreignness clear. When talking about holding our founding fathers, Jefferson and Washington in particular, accountable for being a part of, participating in, and profiting from this inhumane institution that stole people's lives, the response is frequently made that we cannot hold people from the past responsible to modern ethics. No one thought it was wrong at the time, but that ignores the large population of Americans who knew intimately how wrong it was at the time, who experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand, the enslaved Black people themselves. The story of the United States is told from a white perspective that ignores the shared history that we share with Puerto Ricans, Native Hawaiians, other Native Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, and the newest Americans who, like so many of our white ancestors, are coming to this land to flee violence, religious persecution, and starvation. And when we read today's gospel, we can see ourselves in this story when we hear the language we used to draw lines of us and them between people who share common history, but who have distinctive cultures and live side by side. We can hear how to this day people are compared to animals because they have been othered. And we can hear the voice of the woman in this story, echoing across time that she is a woman worthy of God's mercy and love, worthy of healing and wholeness, worthy of being a member of God's household and of our family. We are not just neighbors. We are family. And what hurts those who are members of our family hurts us. We are one body and we need one another to exist. Amen.